Unyielding, The Untold Saga of India's Endurance and Rise. Segment 1, The Roots of Resilience, Ancient India's Foundation. India's journey of survival, resistance, and resurgence begins in the mists of antiquity, where the subcontinent cradled one of the oldest civilizations in the world, the Indus Valley Civilization. Flourishing as early as 2600 BCE along the banks of the Indus and its tributaries, this civilization exemplified urban planning, sophisticated sanitation, and a thriving trade network with Mesopotamia. The foundations laid here, of community, adaptability, and trade, would echo through India's millennia of survival. As the Indus Valley waned, likely due to ecological changes, the Indo-Aryan migrations around 1500 BCE brought new waves of cultural and linguistic evolution. The Vedic period followed, forming the philosophical, social, and spiritual bedrock of Indian civilization. The Rigveda, one of the oldest known texts in human history, laid out ideas of cosmos, order, and duty that would shape Indian society's strength in the face of adversity. While kingdoms rose and fell across the Gangetic plains, it was the capacity for adaptation that remained constant. The Mahajanapadas, regional powers that emerged between 600 BCE and 300 BCE, battled and merged, bringing with them decentralized governance models and pluralistic societies. During this time, the spiritual revolutions of Jainism and Buddhism emerged, challenging orthodoxies and fostering tolerance. India was never a monolith. It was an ever-evolving landscape of cultures, beliefs, and languages. This pluralism was India's first defense. Where invaders might expect a uniform resistance or collapse, they found a deeply embedded diversity that could absorb shock and reconfigure rather than crumble. This resilience grew stronger with the rise of empires. The Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta Maurya and later Ashoka demonstrated a remarkable administrative acumen and moral vision. Ashoka's transformation after the Kalinga War into a Buddhist emperor championing non-violence didn't just redefine kingship, it broadcast India's capacity for ideological evolution without loss of identity. Even after the Mauryan decline, India splintered into regional powers, each nurturing distinct cultures. The Gupta Empire, known as the Golden Age of India, revived Hindu traditions and made significant advances in science, mathematics, and art. Aryabhata's contributions to astronomy and mathematics, including the concept of zero, were milestones not just for India but for all of humanity. The strength here was not just in warriors or kings but in civilizational continuity. Knowledge was decentralized, preserved in temples, universities like Nalanda, and in oral traditions. When nature, war, or political decline threatened one part, others carried the torch. India's continuity wasn't linear, it was a mosaic. But this mosaic would soon be tested by waves of invasions, each more ambitious than the last. Segment 2, Steel and Sand, India's Resistance Against Early Invasions. By the first millennium CE, India had built a civilization as rich and varied as any in the world. But with prosperity came attention. As empires expanded across Central Asia and the Middle East, India's wealth became a beacon, drawing conquerors, raiders, and dreamers from beyond the Hindu Kush. The first wave of foreign invasions came from the northwest. These passes, Khyber, Bolan, and others, served as historical gateways into the Indian subcontinent. The invaders saw opportunity, but they also encountered fierce resistance. In 327 BCE, Alexander of Macedon arrived at the frontiers of India after conquering Persia. His ambitions to subjugate the entire known world led him into battle with the powerful King Pras in the Punjab region. Though Alexander technically won the Battle of the Hydaspes, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Prus's tenacity and command so impressed Alexander that he reinstated him as a ruler, a rare gesture in his conquests. The resistance was so intense, Alexander's army mutinied and refused to march deeper into India. The land was not easily taken. This pattern would repeat over the centuries. India's response to invasion was rarely absolute rejection or submission. Instead, it absorbed, resisted, and transformed the forces that came at it. The next significant incursions came from Central Asia. The Indo-Greeks, Scythians, Kushans, and Huns all left marks on India's political and cultural landscape. These groups brought new languages, trade networks, and occasionally, destruction. But instead of annihilation, India's civilizational core demonstrated an astonishing flexibility. The Kushans, under Kanishka in the 2nd century CE, adopted Indian customs and became patrons of Buddhism. The Silk Road thrived. Gandhara art, blending Hellenistic and Indian elements, flourished, reflecting India's power to transform threats into contributions. But not all invasions were so syncretic. The Huns under Toramana and Miracula were far more destructive, launching brutal attacks in the 5th and 6th centuries. Yet the Gupta Empire and its successors fought back, and while northern India suffered, the south remained largely insulated, becoming a center of art and culture. This geographic resilience, the ability of one region to shield the other, was crucial. India was never one kingdom. When one fell, others rose. When the north burned, the south wrote poetry and built temples. When the east was flooded, the west traded with Arabia and Africa. The great Chalukyas, Pallavas, and later the Cholas in the south proved that even as foreign invaders troubled the north, India's soul endured and innovated. The Cholas built vast navies, controlled Indian ocean trade, and sent cultural missions to Southeast Asia. Indian influence reached Cambodia, Java, and Bali, not through conquest, but through shared belief and soft power. While many civilizations fell under the sword, India absorbed the steel and returned it as art, architecture, and thought. Every attack, every invasion, added a new layer to India's consciousness, but never replaced it. Then came the 8th century. A new chapter opened with the advent of Islamic rule. Segment 3, Crescent and Trishul, India's endurance under Islamic rule. In the 8th century, the winds shifted once again. A new ideological and political force emerged from the West, Islam. The first Islamic incursion came through the Umayyad general Muhammad bin Qasim in 712 CE, who captured Sind. Though his conquest was limited, it marked the beginning of a new era, one that would test India's cultural and civilizational integrity more intensely than ever before. The early Islamic incursions didn't immediately lead to deep political changes in the subcontinent. The Rajput kingdoms, known for their valor and pride, formed the defensive bulwark of northern India. They built massive forts, developed martial codes of honor, and engaged in fierce resistance. Despite their internal rivalries, their resilience against successive invaders became legendary. However, from the 11th century onwards, a new wave of invasions shook the subcontinent, this time, led by Turkic and Afghan dynasties from Central Asia. Mahmud of Ghazni, beginning in 1001 CE, launched 17 raids into India. His goal was not conquest, but plunder. The temples of Somnath, Mathura, and others, symbols of immense religious and material wealth, were looted. But the narrative of these invasions is not one of helplessness. Time and again, Indian kingdoms rebuilt. The Somnath temple, for instance, was rebuilt several times after being destroyed. The stories of resistance by rulers like Suheldev, who defeated Ghaznavid forces at Bahraich, reflect that India was not passive, it bled, but it never bowed. Then came Muhammad Ghori in the late 12th century. His victories laid the groundwork for what would become the Delhi Sultanate. The defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan at the Second Battle of Tarain in 1192 marked a pivotal moment. Unlike Mahmud, Ghori was here to stay. His generals, especially Qutbuddin Aibak, established rule in Delhi. The Islamic era in Indian politics had begun. And yet, even under the Sultanate, India refused to dissolve. Resistance took many forms. The Rajputs continued their defiance in Muir and Mer War. The Deccan remained largely outside northern control. South Indian dynasties, the Hoysalas, Kakatiyas, and later the mighty Vijayanagara Empire, stood tall as bastions of Hindu resistance. Vijayanagara, in particular, became a cultural and military stronghold. Founded in 1336, it was a direct response to the expansion of Islamic rule. Its rulers combined spiritual legitimacy with political authority, defending Dharma while building one of the most advanced cities of its time. It rivaled any capital in Europe or Asia in scale and splendor. Sanskrit, Telugu, Kannada, and Tamil literature flourished, as did architecture and trade. Even in the north, the story was not one of cultural erasure. Islamic rulers, especially the later ones, found themselves adapting to Indian realities. The Delhi Sultanate became Indianized. Persian and Arabic mixed with local dialects to give birth to new languages, Urdu, for instance. Sufi saints like Nizamuddin Auliya and Bhakti poets like Kabir bridged religious divides. India was absorbing even as it was being ruled. The coming of the Mughals in the 16th century added another layer to this complex mosaic. Babur's victory at Panipat in 1526 against Ibrahim Lodi established the Mughal Empire. But even this new dynasty, destined to become one of the richest and most powerful in history, had to earn its place in India, not just through battle, but through legitimacy. Akbar understood this deeply. He married into Rajput families, abolished jizya taxes on Hindus, and initiated Din-i-Ilahi, a spiritual dialogue between faiths. His court became a melting pot of cultures, art, and thought. Under the Mughals, especially Akbar, India was not merely ruled, it was synthesized. Yet resistance never ended. The Deccan Sultanates, Marathas, Ahoms of Assam, Sikhs of Punjab, and countless tribal communities all preserved their autonomy and cultural identity. When Aurangzeb sought to impose stricter religious orthodoxy, the fabric strained. The Mughal Empire expanded territorially, but spiritually it fractured. And from these fractures rose the embers of a new resistance, one that would lay the foundation for a modern Indian identity. Segment 4, Lions of the Deccan, the Marathas and the Rise of Indian Sovereignty. By the late 17th century, the Mughal Empire was approaching its zenith in territory, yet it was already stretched thin. The cost of war, religious discord, and administrative overreach under Aurangzeb created cracks across the imperial structure. And from the rugged hills of the Western Ghats, a new force rose, not as invaders, but as sons of the soil, who would redefine resistance and reinvigorate the spirit of Indian sovereignty, the Marathas. At the center of this rising storm stood Shivaji Bhansal, born in 1630. From a young age, Shivaji was raised with a vision of Swarajya, self-rule rooted in Dharma and local traditions. Using guerrilla tactics, knowledge of terrain, and unwavering purpose, Shivaji established a stronghold in the Deccan and began systematically challenging Mughal and Bijapur control. Shivaji's genius lay in more than just military innovation. He established a structured administrative system, emphasized justice, respected religious diversity, and minted his own currency. He crowned himself Chhatrapati in 1674, marking a symbolic and political declaration of independence from centuries of foreign rule. Shivaji's survival and success were revolutionary because he transformed fragmented resistance into a coherent ideology of sovereignty. He inspired not just soldiers but a civilizational renewal. After his death in 1680, his legacy lived on in the Maratha Confederacy, which would go on to become the most powerful Indian force in the 18th century. As the Mughal Empire weakened after Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Marathas rapidly expanded their influence across the subcontinent. They established control from Tamil Nadu in the south to the gates of Delhi in the north, even exacting tribute from the weakening Mughals. The Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, where the Marathas faced Ahmed Shah Abdali's Afghan forces, was a major setback. The battle was one of the bloodiest fought in Indian history. Despite the tragic loss, it wasn't the end, it was a regrouping. The Maratha spirit, though blooded, remained unbroken. Within a decade, they had regained lost territory and influence. Parallelly, other forces of resistance emerged. In the north, the Sikhs, under the leadership of Guru Gobind Singh and later Maharaja Ranjit Singh, built a formidable state. Their resistance to the Mughals and later the Afghans was rooted in spiritual resilience and martial valor. Ranjit Singh's empire in Punjab was known for its military discipline, administrative efficiency, and religious tolerance. In the northeast, the Arom dynasty of Assam held out against Mughal invasions for over 500 years, including a stunning victory at the Battle of Sarahat in 1671. Their use of riverine warfare and strategic diplomacy was unparalleled. India, in the 18th century, was a tapestry of rising Indian powers reclaiming agency. The Mughal sun was setting, and Indian political agency was not lost, it was decentralizing, diversifying, and reasserting itself. Yet, even as Indians wrested back control from centuries of foreign dominion, a new storm brewed on the horizon, one that would come not with swords and elephants, but with ledgers and ships, and bearing the flag of trade, the British East India Company. And this would lead India into perhaps its most brutal chapter, a struggle not just of armies, but of memory, economics, identity, and soul. Segment 5, Empire of Exploitation, India under British rule. The 18th century saw a new kind of invader. Not one led by kings or caliphs, but by merchants cloaked in diplomacy and backed by one of the most powerful navies on earth, the British East India Company. What began as trade evolved into treachery. In the guise of commerce, the British steadily sowed seeds of dominance. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company, through strategic bribery and betrayal, defeated the Nawab of Bengal. This was not merely a battle, it was the turning point. It marked the beginning of formal British colonization of India. Unlike the Mughals or Turks, the British did not seek cultural integration. Their empire was built on extraction. India became a colony in the truest sense, a land drained to enrich another. Bengal, once among the richest provinces of India, was subjected to ruthless taxation, causing the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, which killed over 10 million people. The company's goal was clear: profit. Farmers were forced to grow indigo and opium instead of food. Indian industries were dismantled. The textile industry, once globally dominant, was decimated to make room for British factories. Resistance came early and often. From tribal revolts in Chotanagpur and Basta to princely defiance by rulers like Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan in Mysore, the fire never dimmed. Tipu, known as the Tiger of Mysore, even forged alliances with the French to resist British advances. His death in 1799 was mourned not just in India but across the Islamic world. The early 19th century saw more uprisings: the Vellore Mutiny of 1806, the Paika Rebellion in Odisha, and countless tribal uprisings, including those by the Santhals, Bhils, and Kols. These were not isolated sparks, they were smouldering embers of a nation that refused to forget its dignity. Then came 1857, a turning point that would shake the foundations of British confidence. What began as a sepoy revolt in Meerut turned into a nationwide uprising. Hindus and Muslims fought side by side, not under one flag, but driven by one fire: freedom. Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, and Gwalior became battlegrounds of courage. The likes of Rani Lakshmibai, Tanshia Tope, and Bahadur Shah Zafar led with valor against overwhelming odds. Though brutally suppressed, the First War of Independence in 1857 changed everything. It ended the East India Company's rule and brought India directly under the British Crown. The Queen's proclamation promised equal rights and religious freedom, but in practice, it tightened control and deepened racial segregation. India's pain was now institutionalized. Divide and rule became policy. Hindus and Muslims were pitted against each other. Education was westernized to create clerks, not leaders. Indian agriculture was tethered to global markets, making it vulnerable to fluctuations. Famines in the late 19th century, such as those in 1876 and 1899, killed millions, not because of scarcity, but because of apathy. But while the British extracted wealth, India grew in another way, through consciousness. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of a national awakening. Reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Swami Vivekananda, Dadabhai Naoroji, and Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya rekindled India's historical pride and spiritual roots. Newspapers, pamphlets, and poetry replaced swords for a time. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, was born not of violence, but of vision. And when Mahatma Gandhi returned from South Africa in 1915, a new chapter began, not of armed rebellion, but of moral revolution. His call for non-violent resistance, or satyagraha, united millions across caste, creed, and class. Salt became a symbol. Cloth became a weapon. Marches, fasts, and boycotts echoed through every village. Even children and women joined the freedom struggle. Leaders like Subhas Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, Sarojini Naidu, and Sardar Patel carried the torch forward. British repression intensified, massacres like Jallianwala Bagh, the Rowlatt Act, and brutal imprisonments followed. But each act of cruelty only strengthened the Indian resolve. By the 1940s, the cracks in the empire were too many. World War II drained British resources. The Quit India movement of 1942, led by Gandhi, demanded complete withdrawal. Meanwhile, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army fought alongside Axis powers with the slogan, "Give me blood, and I will give you freedom." The final blow came not from violence, but exhaustion. On the 15th of August 1947, India awoke to freedom, battered, bruised, but unbroken. Partition scarred the soul. Over 1 million died, and millions more were displaced. Yet, in the midst of chaos, a democratic republic emerged, rooted in pluralism, secularism, and sovereignty. But independence was not the end. It was the beginning of another monumental struggle, rebuilding a civilization after 2 centuries of economic destruction. Segment 6, Ashes to Ambition, Rebuilding India from Ruin. On the morning of the 15th of August, 1947, as the Indian tricolour was hoisted over Delhi for the first time, it marked not just the end of colonial rule but the start of a colossal challenge. Independence came at a price, a nation divided, an economy drained, and a people disoriented after centuries of occupation. India inherited a skeletal state, a literacy rate below 20%, average life expectancy under 40 years, industries that had been gutted by British policies, and an agrarian population caught in cycles of debt and famine. Partition had displaced over 14 million people, sparking violence, communal hatred, and a refugee crisis of unprecedented proportions. The newly formed government had no roadmap, only resolve. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, addressed the Constituent Assembly with his famous Tryst with Destiny speech. It wasn't triumphalism, it was tempered optimism. India stood free, but not whole. Nehru and his colleagues, including Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, faced the Herculean task of uniting a country of hundreds of languages, dozens of religions, castes, and princely states into one democratic republic. They began with the Constitution, a living document that would enshrine the ideals of equality, liberty, and justice. Drafted under Ambedkar's leadership, it came into effect on the 26th of January, 1950. It abolished untouchability, guaranteed universal suffrage, and made India a sovereign, secular, socialist republic, a bold vision for a country with a feudal past and a fractured present. Economically, India pursued a path of self-reliance through centralized planning. The 5-year plans, inspired by socialist models, focused on heavy industries, dams, steel plants, and scientific research. Institutions like the Indian Institutes of Technology, LITs, and Indian Space Research Organisation, ISRO, were established with the belief that science would be India's ladder to progress. There were failures. The license Raj, bureaucratic red tape, and excessive state control stifled entrepreneurship. Famines and food insecurity loomed large in the 1960s. Yet even amidst crisis, the Green Revolution, led by M.S. Swaminathan, helped India achieve food self-sufficiency by the 1970s, saving millions from starvation. On the global stage, India maintained non-alignment during the Cold War, refusing to be a pawn in the ideological tug-of-war between the US and USSR. This independence in foreign policy earned India respect but also left it isolated during times of need. Through wars with Pakistan, 1947, 1965, 1971, and China, 1962, India's resolve was tested militarily. The 1971 war, which led to the creation of Bangladesh, was a decisive moment. India had not just defended itself, it had altered the map of South Asia. Internally, democracy was strained during the emergency, 1975-77, declared by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, when civil liberties were suspended and the press censored. But the resilience of India's democratic institutions shone through. The people voted the government out in 1977, a global rarity at the time for a young democracy. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, India saw social upheaval, Sikh militancy in Punjab, the assassination of Indira Gandhi, communal riots, the rise of caste-based political mobilization, and insurgencies in Kashmir and the northeast. Yet it never collapsed. India's survival wasn't accidental, it was by design, built into the bones of its constitution and the diversity of its people. And then came 1991, the year India stood on the brink of financial collapse. With barely 2 weeks of foreign reserves left, the country faced economic disaster. But instead of succumbing, it chose transformation. Segment 7, The Roar Awakens, Economic Liberalization and the March to the Top 5. In 1991, India stood at the precipice of economic collapse. Foreign exchange reserves had dwindled to levels barely sufficient to cover 2 weeks of imports. Inflation was high, the balance of payments was in crisis, and the government was forced to mortgage gold to stay afloat. The world saw a faltering state, but within, India was preparing for rebirth. The response to the crisis was radical and unprecedented. Under Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, India launched sweeping economic liberalization. In one masterstroke, decades of protectionism, licensing, and state monopoly were dismantled. The license Raj was broken. Tariffs were slashed, the rupee was devalued, and markets were opened to foreign investment. For a nation long burdened by colonial exploitation and socialist inertia, this was the sound of shackles breaking. India's economy began to grow, first cautiously, then with momentum. The private sector, long suppressed, blossomed. Indian entrepreneurs, long stifled by red tape, now found wings. The software and services revolution, led by visionaries like Narayana Murthy, Infosys, and Azim Premji, Wipro, turned India into the back office of the world. The Y2K scare of the late 1990s became India's golden opportunity. Thousands of Indian engineers, coders, and consultants were hired globally. What began as outsourced labor evolved into world-class innovation. Cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Pune emerged as tech capitals. But this rise was not limited to IT. The pharmaceutical industry, automobile manufacturing, telecommunications, education, and finance also surged. By the 2000s, India was no longer seen as a struggling post-colonial state, it was an emerging global powerhouse. India's economic growth averaged 6–8% annually, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. A rising middle class emerged, educated, aspirational, and globally connected. Mobile phones penetrated every village, satellite TV reached the remotest homes, and internet access expanded rapidly. Despite this, survival was not linear. India still grappled with poverty, inequality, corruption, and bureaucratic inertia. Infrastructure lagged. Rural areas needed attention. But the difference now was momentum. India was moving, and it refused to look back. In 2014, a significant political shift occurred. A government led by Narendra Modi came to power with a promise of development and reform. Major initiatives followed: Digital India, Make in India, Startup India, and large-scale infrastructure projects. Direct cash transfers, order-based welfare systems, and the push for a cashless economy began reshaping governance. India's resilience was tested again, by global slowdowns, by the COVID-19 pandemic, and by geopolitical pressures. Yet through lockdowns, health crises, and supply chain shocks, the country adapted. Vaccines were developed at record speed. Distribution at scale was achieved. Even in crisis, India innovated, digitized, and decentralized. By the early 2020s, India emerged as the world's fifth largest economy, surpassing the UK, its former colonial master. This wasn't just economic irony, it was civilizational poetry. India's GDP crossed $3.7 trillion. Its stock markets reached global highs. It became a major destination for foreign direct investment, a hub of digital innovation, and a voice in global climate diplomacy. But the true measure of survival was not just in numbers. It was in how India preserved its soul. Despite facing one of the longest stretches of foreign rule in human history, India never lost its civilizational essence. It adapted without assimilating, resisted without annihilating, and rose without forgetting. The story of India is not just about freedom or growth. It's about the unbroken thread, from the sages of the Vedas to the scientists of ISRO, from the chants of Upanishads to the coding hubs of Bengaluru. Segment 8. The Eternal Phoenix, Civilizational Continuity and the Spirit of Survival. India's ascent to becoming the world's fifth largest economy is undeniably impressive. But its deeper triumph lies not merely in GDP, stock indices, or export figures, it lies in something far more enduring, the survival of an ancient civilization through the harshest trials of history. Against every invasion, colonization, and fragmentation, India remained. How does a civilization survive when its temples are torn down, its scripts lost, its scholars exiled, and its people enslaved? India's answer was simple, yet profound: absorb, adapt, endure. It endured the Turkic conquests, Mongol raids, Persian onslaughts, Afghan incursions, and European colonization. Each wave sought to dominate and dissolve India's identity, but each one ended up enriching it. No invader left unchanged. No culture entered unchallenged. India's survival stemmed from its cultural decentralization. Unlike monolithic empires, its spiritual and social life was spread across thousands of temples, monasteries, languages, traditions, and philosophies. Even when empires fell, the village, the family, and the faith endured. It was a civilization that saw contradiction not as conflict but as complexity. It could house atheistic philosophies like Shavaka, the devotional fervor of Bhakti saints, the ritualistic rigors of Mimamsa, and the non-violence of Jain monks, all within one spiritual geography. Language, too, became a vessel of endurance. Even as Persian, Arabic, and later English flowed in, Sanskrit never died. It lived in rituals, mantras, poetry, and grammar. Regional languages like Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, Bengali, and Malayalam flourished. India became a multilingual miracle, not through central control, but through organic coexistence. Philosophy remained central to daily life. India questioned everything, from the nature of self and consciousness to the workings of karma and time. It never feared doubt, in fact, it embraced debate, through Shastrartha, the ancient practice of intellectual disputation. Even under colonial suppression, India's spiritual fire was never extinguished. The Renaissance of the 19th and early 20th centuries, fueled by figures like Swami Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, Rabindranath Tagore, Dayananda Saraswati, and Mahatma Gandhi, reignited civilizational confidence. Swami Vivekananda's famous speech at the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893 didn't just present Hinduism to the West, it reclaimed India's intellectual heritage on a global stage. Through every struggle, whether political, economic, or social, India never forgot that it was more than a nation. It was a Sanskriti, a culture, a consciousness, a continuity. What makes India unbreakable is not the absence of pain, but the abundance of meaning. Even when partition tore the land apart, even when poverty ravaged generations, even when corruption mocked democracy, India endured. Because it wasn't just held together by policy, it was held together by shared memory, shared myth, and shared longing. From the Ramayana being sung in Thailand, to yoga being practiced in California, from Ayurveda in Berlin to Buddhist chants in Tokyo, India's spirit has seeped into global consciousness, not by conquest, but by wisdom. In the 21st century, India stands not just as a geopolitical player, but as a civilizational lighthouse. It leads global meditation movements, hosts massive democratic elections, sends satellites to the moon, and contributes CEOs to multinational corporations. It is poor in some districts, yet rich in ancient knowledge. It is chaotic on its streets, yet poetic in its scriptures. It is wounded in places, yet unbowed in essence. India survived because India never gave up on itself. Segment 9, The Road Ahead, The Responsibility of a Rising Giant. India has survived invasions, risen from colonization, and emerged as a global economic force. But survival is no longer enough. Now comes the harder task, leading without losing oneself. As the fifth largest economy and one of the world's most populous nations, India stands at a historic threshold. With that status comes a civilizational responsibility, to shape the future not just for its people, but for the planet. One balancing growth and heritage. India's next challenge lies in maintaining the delicate balance between technological advancement and cultural preservation. Urban skylines rise where ancient ghats still echo with chants. Artificial intelligence is being trained while Sanskrit mantras are still recited. Digital payments flourish while temple economies survive on coins and rice offerings. India must ensure that its leap into the future does not erase the script of its past. The world looks to India for a model that is not just GDP-driven, but ethically rooted. A model where Dharma and development can coexist. 2. Championing democracy in a fractured world. In a world tilting toward authoritarianism, India is a living experiment in pluralistic democracy. With over 900 million voters, it conducts the largest democratic exercises ever attempted. Despite its flaws, polarization, corruption, inefficiencies, India's democracy has never broken. That alone is extraordinary. But the future demands more. India must strengthen its institutions, protect dissent, and empower its minorities, not as political strategies but as civilizational duties. Diversity was never a threat to India, it was its deepest strength. 3. Spiritual capital as global soft power. The West is rediscovering what India never forgot, that fulfillment does not lie in material wealth alone. Yoga, meditation, Vedanta, and Ayurveda are now part of the global wellness vocabulary. These are not exports. They are offerings. In an anxious, overstimulated world, India holds the potential to become the spiritual teacher of the 21st century, a guide not just in breathing techniques or herbal cures, but in how to live with purpose, restraint, and inner clarity. 4. Innovation from the grassroots. India's genius has always been in finding solutions from the bottom up. Whether it's frugal engineering, vernacular education, or local governance through panchayats, the spirit of Jugaad, creative problem solving, is uniquely Indian. The future lies in scaling these innovations: clean energy in Ladakh, mobile healthcare in rural Bihar, smart farming in Tamil Nadu. India's success will not be measured by skyscrapers alone, but by whether villages can thrive alongside cities. 5. Healing historical wounds. Survival has a cost. Centuries of colonization and fragmentation have left deep psychological and social scars. India must now heal, not by denying its past, but by transcending it. This healing involves honest dialogue about caste, gender, and inequality. It involves justice, not revenge, for historical wrongs. It involves teaching children not only how India suffered, but how India survived. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means moving forward with wisdom. Conclusion: from survival to stewardship. India's story is unlike any other. A land of 1,000 invasions and 1,000,000 prayers, it has walked through fire without being consumed. It has been plundered, partitioned, and impoverished, and yet, it sings. It dances. It thinks. It builds. It has not just survived. It has endured with grace. Now, as it ascends among the great powers of the 21st century, the question is no longer can India survive? It is, can India show the world how to survive and thrive without losing the soul? The answer, written across millennia, is yes.